back in the 1950s, when the National Historic Preservation and Records Commission was established, there was a lot more federal support. And that's when they started these big projects. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, on up through modern presidents. And I said, you just can't get the money to do those anymore. It's too expensive. There's not enough. They don't sell enough of them, and it's really very intensive labor. So I don't really think that's possible. But I had Richard's idea in mind, and so I thought I would teach when the digital humanities rolled along. And you know, if you've been teaching as long as I have, these things roll through. You know, people in administration get excited about different things at different times, and you either get on the boat or you don't get on the boat. Some things you're interested in, some things go away if you ignore them for a little while. But this one sounded interesting, even though I'm not a techie type guy, as you could see from the amount of time it took us to get set up with the laptop. You know. With the digital humanities, as I understood it then and as I understand it now, means that you use computers to do some of the work that the humanities have always been interested in. So they're an extension of the humanities. They're not a change in what we do, but they're a change in the way we do it and the ways in which we connect to students. Who are much more interested in the technology, mainly their telephones, but not just the telephones, and who pick up this stuff really, really quickly because it's the world that they live in, the world of computers. So I said to my colleagues, this can't be a fashion, this can't be something that's going to go away, digital humanities, unless computers are going to go away. So we have things, you've probably heard the terms big data, and there are other ways of talking about the different kinds of technologies that can be involved to do the same sorts of things that historians and English professors and anthropologists do. But now they're going to be web-based. They're going to be based on the computer. They're going to be searchable. And so Richard's idea, imagining a paper edition of the papers of William Henry Seward in the early 21st century, that idea would become something like a website that has searchable access to these papers. So I thought, okay, well, I'll try teaching a class. And again, my colleague said, how are you going to do that? You don't know anything about designing and building websites. You don't know anything about text encoding. You don't know how to do this. And I said, well, neither does anybody else, and we'll pick it up. We'll start teaching it, and we'll learn from teaching it, which is kind of the opposite of the way college professors are most comfortable. Generally, my crowd is most comfortable coming in as the expert and telling everybody else what the truth is. I said, no, I'm going to go into the classroom, and we're going to start looking at these papers. We're never going to get to 350,000. We'll figure out a way that it makes sense to begin to use those papers in a way that they haven't been used before, and then we'll figure something out. The university's got programmers. The university has experts in digitizing documents, manuscripts, photos, other things. We have archivists. So we've got people here who know how to do different parts of this, and we'll all work together. Now that too was seen as a little bit optimistic because as difficult as external institutional collaborations might be, and you all, some of you at least may have had careers in which you know exactly what I'm talking about, internal collaborations within institutions can be even harder because people in different entities have histories together, and there's all kinds of things, some of which you really, really hope that nobody even tells you about. You don't know where the bodies are buried, and they probably aren't people who even work here anymore, but there's all kinds of stuff going on, and this was no different. So I needed to work with the history department, two of the different parts of the library, and get support from administration, and try to get grant money to do this stuff. So that was hard. And then we wanted to work with the Seward House Museum. It made no sense to me that we'd work with the papers without working with this wonderful museum in Auburn of the house that these people lived in. They lived on South Street in Auburn going back to about 1817 and on through 1950. William Henry Seward, his son, and William Henry Seward, his wife Frances, her family, live in the house that her father had built, Judge Miller, I'll talk about in a minute. And then William Henry Seward Jr., his wife, his 3 children lived in that house. And then William Henry Seward III lived in that house. And in 1950, when he died, he donated these 350,000 pages of manuscripts to the University of Rochester, and he also had money to turn over to the Emerson Foundation, the house to be turned into a memorial. And this is a really good house museum, partly because it's a really interesting house, surviving in different forms of renovation going back to 1817, but it also is just amazingly full. I mean, it's overflowing full. They entertained in when he was the Secretary of State in Washington, D.C. How many sets of china? I've forgotten. Lots of sets of china. A glass for every liquid that human beings consume, right? Because you drink different wines in different glasses. And the cutlery to go with all these things. And that's just the dining room. They've got clothing, they've got the furniture, they've got over 7,000 books that are left from when the Sewards lived there. So it's a really rich and overflowing house museum. So I thought if you could give the students the experience with these manuscripts, and we could connect up to the museum, it would make a kind of a full educational experience. Well, what the students and I found when we started off was that what we were really interested in was the family's papers, the family's letters. Because William Henry Seward was famous, and they always thought he would be, apparently, because they started saving things long before he was famous. We got things going back to when he was a kid and a little bit from when his wife was a child. They saved everything. And they have over, now I think, between 6,000 and 7,000 family letters. These are letters, some of them written by the children when they were quite young. I gave you one of them from 1837 there. We've got letters to Santa Claus. We've got all kinds of stuff. We've got the children's first experiments, because writing letters was how you communicated, right? You didn't, kids text. Those kids learned how to write letters. They learned good handwriting. So I teach the students, I got the students the handwriting manuals from the 19th century that people used, and the handwriting exercise books, and we got reproductions of 19th century pens, so they could mess up trying to actually, right, and they know, and you know this too, right? I mean, 20-year-olds don't know cursive handwriting. They don't know how to do it, and for the most part, I know when we get Christmas messages from friends our age and older with handwritten notes, they might as well have been in a foreign language. We'd have to read them out loud to our children because they couldn't read them. So these kids we're teaching them in the history of handwriting. We're teaching them the history of the technology of pens. We're teaching them the history of social letter writing, which has, there are rules for this. There are ways in which you write a letter. And also, since we're dealing with Victorians, there are things you say and things you don't say in a letter. And there's an order in which you say them. And all of these are things that we're learning. I don't teach these to the students. They discover these things. They learn them. They're active participants in this process and in the research. And so we thought these family letters were really interesting and that we would focus on the family letters. And so we began to do this about 7 years ago. We then found that other people thought that what we're doing is interesting. Family history is now popular. In the 1950s, when these 350,000 pages of manuscripts came to the University of Rochester, they assumed historians would be interested in them for the diplomatic correspondence, for the political letters between Seward and his political mentor and colleagues in the Republican Party, first Whig, then Republican Party. But they didn't even imagine that anybody'd be interested in women's history. These are full of, what kind of stuff's in there? There's a lot of information about the history of medicine, diagnosis, treatment, practice. There's a lot about child rearing in these letters. There's a whole lot about people's interpersonal relationships. All of these are utterly and completely fascinating. But for some reason that I don't think I've fully plumbed, that I completely understand, by far most of the students interested in this are young women and not young men. My classes are a great place for young guys to meet women because we've got 15 students being paid on the grants that we've got. 13 of the 15 are men. Have you met any of the men who work with our project? No. There are 2 of them, really. Yeah. So it's a women's culture, which I'm actually very happy with. As I pointed out to one of them the other day, none of the guys ever make brownies. But they've also created, it's been really interesting over the past half dozen years working with them, because it's a women's culture. And they bring new students into this process in the way women bring people into groups. And I really, really like it. It's a really nice a nice way in which they relate to each other. It's nowhere near as competitive as it is when with the men I work with, which is it's just different. So this is all very good. We started working with these letters, and what we decided to do is that we wanted to transcribe. I'm almost to you guys. That we wanted to transcribe them according to professional standards for documentary editing. So I had to learn what those were. And so the Association for Documentary Editing is the professional group for professional editors who do all those paper projects I was talking about, all those manuscript collections I talked about. And they've got rules, and they are supported in the establishment of rules for consistency by the National Historic Preservation and Records Commission, which is a branch of the National Archives. And so together they have established these rules. So we learned these rules. And I went to the summer, they call it a camp, I forget what the official name is, to the editing camp, and got certified as a documentary editor, and subsequently 3 of the graduate students did too. So we know how to do it right, we know how to do it consistently, so we're not inventing the wheel. Same thing for digitization. There are rules about how you digitize images, how you take photographs of images. There are rules for how you annotate, how you identify people and their birth dates and their death dates and their relationships to each other, all of which is what we're doing. So we learned all of those things. And right at the beginning, one of the people we were working with in the digital humanities said, you have to document not just these letters that you're transcribing and annotating, creating a website for, putting up online, all of that. You have to document how you do it. And so what we eventually found out, that I didn't know at the beginning either, is that there are at least as many people interested in how you establish these guidelines, how you train people to do this, how you train non-professionals to do this, how you train students to the professional standards of these documentary editing projects that are run by only people with PhDs in history, how you do that. One of my students went to the Highlands at Pittsford to give a talk about what we were doing. And when he came back, he said, that was a really great audience. And these people were really interested in what we were talking about doing, were really interested in transcribing and editing these letters. Have you ever thought, this is his idea, Mike Reed's his name, he said, have you ever thought about trying to include volunteers in this? And I said, well, gee, I thought we were pretty busy already. This is going to be something else for us to figure out. But I went out and I gave a lecture at the Highlands too, and obviously Mike was right. This is an audience much like this one, that does know how to read cursive handwriting. An audience of people who have actually written letters, not only read letters, and people who I know that, and this too is a challenge for the kids, our vocabulary accommodates a 19th century vocabulary much more easily than theirs does. So there are a lot of words that they have trouble transcribing because either they don't even know that they are words, or they're used in an entirely different way. And it's not as alien to us as it is to them, but that's all part of the learning process. So with one of the freshmen I had, who's from Queens, and she's got, you know, the lovely Queens accent, as well as the Queens vocabulary, and she and I were kidding each other about these words that she was discovering, and I said, let's make a database. So we call the database Sewords, S-E-W-O-R-D-S, and every time they find a word that is new to them, she looks it up in two 19th century dictionaries. So she's bookending when, you know, say this letter is 1837, she's got an 1830 and an 1850 dictionary, so she's finding how it would have been used back then. And we've created a glossary of these too, which is it's really good. But so, we originally thought this match of retired volunteers and 20 to 30-year-old is really perfect. Because all the people we started working with at the Highlands aren't familiar with using a laptop for much else besides email and shopping, and so they were they needed some basic instruction, which I'm sure you didn't need, on how to use the word processing feature in the way that the students need to use it for what's going on. So there's a little bit of computer literacy for older people, which the students are perfectly comfortable and very good at, in my experience of watching them do this and helping them learn how to do this, very good at doing. So they help with the technology, and they know the guidelines and the rules, which we now have written down and available on the website, so you can find them yourself to reinforce what the students are teaching you. And the volunteers, once the volunteers learn how to transcribe, you all are much faster at it than they are. It takes them at least twice as long to transcribe a letter as it does somebody who can actually read cursive handwriting, who doesn't find the vocabulary entirely alien. So once you know the basic format in which we do this and know how to make your computer do what it's supposed to do for you, you're actually much better at it. They're much more fluent at it than they are. So this combines really in a way that we all find really, really fun, combining two groups to try to understand something about this 19th century family. Now, this family, this is the house as it looks now, but this is a mansion, right? But it's really three different stages of renovation. This that's the south tower and the south entrance, that was only put on in the 1860s after Frances Seward died. So it's her father's house, built in 1817. Her mother dies comparatively young, and so Frances Miller and her sister Lizette and their father live in this house, and its first embodiment. And then there's two major renovations, new staircase, and it's much bigger. And this is looking at it from the south to the north from the garden. It's got had in the 19th century really stunningly beautiful gardens that they're just learning now how you would begin to try to get them back. And we find that in the letters too. Now this is the family as we started off with them in the 1820s, because the Henry, they call him Henry, William Henry Seward, who's the fourth from your right one. Okay, that's Frances, Henry's wife. That's their two little kids. Gus on the left, Augustus, and Fred on the right with the whips there. Then William Henry Seward, not a very tall fellow. Aunt Clary, Aunt Clarissa, who is the sister of Judge Miller, who's Elijah Miller, who's the second from the left, and that's his mother. And those are the people who live in the house during the 1830s. This is the way they looked, more or less, in the 1830s as well. But of course, not just them. This is a big house, right? So we've got staff. They call them help. They don't ever use the word servant, but they call them help. It's always hard to figure out exactly how many people are working there, but you have probably a man who works with the horses, probably also same man works in the garden, different times of the year. He'll have an assistant. Frances would like to have a steady cook. It's hard to maintain long-term cooks at that time period. You like to have a couple of young girls, teenage girls, to do cleaning and laundry. And we might call them, at first we thought they would be parallel to what we might call a nanny. But actually, when we found out that they were 10, 11, 12 years old, we decided that they were like babysitters. So in fact, the girls, these are always girls who are helping with the children, are themselves children. And this creates real challenges to household management because they act like children. And so here, it's some help, but it's complicated help, and it's not at all an easy job to be running this household, which is what Frances Seward is doing. Her preference would be for American-born help. There's a real shortage of that. Good luck with that. Her second choice, which would have been possible earlier, but isn't in the 1830s when they look like they did in that image, with Germans. There aren't enough German immigrants anymore, or the German immigrants have moved on and are no longer hiring on as household help. Third preference would be African Americans, and there are a lot of African Americans, former slaves, some of them escaped slaves. This house does serve provide refuge for some fugitive slaves at different points in time in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. And so we have some fugitive slave. And the last choice? Irish. Frances Seward is, we would call her a progressive, a liberal. She's, in terms of race and class and gender, she's in a lot of ways, she's very modern. Her bigotry against the Irish is totally unreformed. And it's based on personal experience. She finds the girls that she can get to work in her household to have a whole raft of qualities of which she's very intolerant. And so I don't know if you've seen any letters in which she unloads on the Irish. Yeah, you've seen those, yeah. I feel a little embarrassed for her because I love Frances in a lot of ways, but she does not have much good to say about the Irish. So it's his house. It's Elijah Miller's house. He's a judge. William Henry Seward comes to Auburn to work for Judge Miller in his law office, and it's Judge Miller's house. He marries the judge's daughter, but it's still the judge's house. And we think that Henry's never, really happy about that. And you've got to explain why Henry spends so much time away from home. And I'm not saying it's all because it's not his house, but he's a character. He's always there. And his two daughters, defer to him. And as he gets older, I've heard this. Do you think this is true? Older people get more and more set in their ways? No, it's not right, is it? But they have a front parlor. And it is in their circle. Calling is the main way of socializing. You go to somebody's house unannounced, but you know what times, right? Without anybody setting times for you. You don't come to a woman's house before noon because it takes a long time to get the household rolling. It takes a long time to get into those clothes. It takes a long time. So you don't want to show up too early. But anyway, you show up and you don't stay very long. On average, you stay between 10 and 20 minutes. It's a call. How are you? Everybody okay? Did you hear about so-and-so who's run off with whatever? Whatever they've got to say to each other. But it doesn't last very long. And if they're not there, you leave a card. So we also have these cards. We've got hundreds and hundreds of these cards. You leave the card. That means I was here. You owe me a call now. I owe you nothing. And so that's the way it all works. But anyway, one day, just about when calling time's about to start, the women hear banging in the front parlor, and they go to see what's happening. He's come downstairs with nails and a hammer, is hammering nails into the mantle of the fireplace, where he proceeds to hang his wet socks. He had decided. And what do? It's his house. So you're going to be receiving callers that day with wet socks hanging in front, right? And so there were things like this. And he had, again, as he got older, he had a thing about, why do we need so many fireplaces going at the same time? Well, because there's, somebody's upstairs, somebody's got it downstairs. Everybody get in the same room. So there were all these arguments about how warm it should be, how firewood, but it was his house, and so that's principally the way we see him, through the eyes of other people who are at times walking on eggshells because they don't want to. They don't. I don't know if he had a temper. I don't know. They just don't want to do that. I mean, he's dad. He's father. It's his house. This is Frances, married to William Henry Seward. She tends to be our favorite member of the family. And the reasons that she's our favorite member of the family is because she writes so many letters. And her letters are much more full of information than those of other members of the family. So we feel like we get to know her better. She's also an avid reader, so she talks about literature. We like that too. And so we established a database. Every piece of literature, every author, every book, we annotate all of those too. And we have, since we've got 7,000 books in the museum still, we can actually annotate it to the actual book itself. We can connect it to the exact edition in most of these cases. But we have, 8,000, at this point I think around 8,000 pieces of literature, authors' titles mentioned here, and she was a big reader. She was the biggest reader in the family. We also have a pamphlet collection that comes as part of this Seward collection. Pamphlets were the ephemeral literature of the 19th century. They did have magazines, but pamphlets were a little longer form, but also cheap, made cheaply. That's where you'd go for topical information. So it can be, a lot of medical research gets published in pamphlets, a lot of sermons, political speeches, phrenology, checking bumps on your head to figure out who you are. There's lots of stuff. She was, when these came to the university, they were initially described as his pamphlet collection. But we now know from reading the letters that most of them probably came through her. Even a lot of the political ones, she was close friends with Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, anti-slavery radical, much more radical than her husband. And Sumner's sending her political pamphlets because politically, she and Sumner are closer together than she is with her husband, who's a little to the center, much less radical than she is. So even the political pamphlets, but the medical pamphlets, a lot of them hers, the ones that have to do with religion or sermons, they're likely hers. So she's responsible for a lot of the books. She teaches the children, which is very common at the time, up to a certain age. She runs her own little school for the boys. I think it's mentioned in one of these letters I gave you just now. She has one of the things she has is a book on how to educate your daughter specifically, and they do have one daughter, 3 sons and 1 daughter. They have another daughter who dies in infancy, which is mentioned in another letter that I gave some of you. But she takes this book on how to educate your daughter, and she goes through and she checks off what she does. She crosses out what she doesn't like. She adds what she thinks you should add. So it's really, we've got a lot of rich sources. And now that you can put the books and any annotations in the books together with the letters and the discussion of them, it becomes much richer to try to figure out this family and other families, which is part of the problem here for them. This is William Henry Seward when he's young, 1830s. This is when he's a state senator. He is apparently one of the world's more charming people. In the 19th century. Great storyteller, somebody that people enjoy meeting at a party. He and Lincoln get along famously, if you've read the book in which the two of their relationship figures centrally. He is an extrovert, needs to be busy, not, content. Although he'd like to be, and when they marry, he thinks he will be content, practicing law, working in their garden, being a husband and father, and he never is. He never is. He's never really good at any of those things except politics. And so you'll see these letters of his when he's away, either in Albany or Washington, or he's gone to Europe with his father. Eventually he goes all the way around the world. But he'll say, "Oh, I can't wait till I get home. I miss you all so much," and he'll go on and on about all of this. And then you see he gets home and he's back on the road within 2 weeks. I mean, he seldom stays there for longer. And to be sure, he's doing things. He's not like he's just going to be gone. He's deeply involved in land speculation. He's the representative for the Holland Land Company out Batavia area. There, great big land company. He's also a practicing lawyer, so he follows the circuit courts, and then he's involved in politics. So and he's apparently a great speaker as well. And we have his written speeches, which don't give you much of that. But there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about what a powerful speaker was. And he comes this close to being the Republican nominee. I don't know, this close, that close. Got close to being the Republican nominee for president in 1860. I like to say if they hadn't held the Republican convention in Illinois, you wouldn't have expected the Illinois guy to win. But once they do decide to hold it in Illinois, the Illinois guy is going to win. It's more complicated than that, to be sure. But he was going into the convention, he was the favored candidate in 1860. Was seen as being a bit less moderate than Lincoln. That was one of the problems with his candidacy. But politics was politics. It still is, right? This is their oldest son, Augustus, Gus. Now, in the letters that we've got, in which that Gus either writes when he's a little boy or is mentioned when he's a little boy, he's described as this really active little guy who's just full of personality and really happy and a tad on the wild side. And then we find, when you look at Gus in the 1860s, he's a grown man. He's really shy. He seems to be, if not afraid of women, at least uncomfortable around women, never marries, even looks depressive to some degree. And we're thinking, what happened to Gus, right? Because we decided to start in two places. We started at the beginning and we started at the end, and then now we're working on the middle. And what happened? We right from the beginning, the students are saying, what happened to Gus? I mean, he was such a, and now he's so, all the photographs. I think I've got one here, family photographs. He's always off to the side. He seems like a loner. His mother worries about him more than about anybody else. And then we came across this letter in the 1830s when he was a little kid. And I don't know this explains it, but we wonder about this. And so Frances is describing this. She and her sister Lizette are sitting in the parlor chatting away, and Lizette's daughter, also named Frances, and Gus, all of a sudden they notice that they're not there, right? Ever happen? All right, where'd they go? Where are they? So they start looking for them. By the time they find them, they find the two children dipping their fingers into a bucket of paint and licking them. Now, we think we know, they don't know how long they've been doing this. We think we know that the lead content of paint in the 19th century was pretty high. So we wonder, I mean, he could have gotten all those personality characteristics that, genetically or environmentally, or they might have manifested themselves later in life. But we wonder about how much paint Gus ate. Who knows, right? This is Fred. Fred becomes Assistant Secretary of State when his father's Secretary of State. He does marry. He has a career in the diplomatic corps, works his whole life, and writes some really interesting reminiscences. He's always seen as the bookish of the three sons, the most bookish of the three sons, quiet side. Imagine a range of possible careers for him, but working with his father. He edits his father's autobiography and a lot of his father's letters, stuff like that. He's a loyal, dutiful son who never causes them a whole lot of trouble. Gus, on the other hand, he wants to go to West Point. And his mother, who's Quaker educated and has, as I said, a set of politics that lead her to be more towards pacifism, does not want her son going into the Army. She's worried about him. She doesn't really admire military careers, I think, fairly enough, so she's against it. And Dad makes it happen. And then Gus gets into West Point, and in his first year, he racks up the second most demerits in his whole class. His roommate has the most. He has the second most. He comes very close to getting thrown out. But eventually, they get the roommate separated, and he goes on. And he serves his life is not a long life, but he serves in the military. He's paymaster. So he never actually, and I think this is probably during the Civil War a function of having a father who's politically connected. He's never actually on the battlefield. He does go to Mexico with the Army, and he does go out west, Indians, but he's never actually shooting at or shot by anybody as far as I know. Will. Interesting that the third-born son gets to be the junior, but he does. He will inherit the house. He's the only one who has children. He has 3 children, and so William Henry Seward, he becomes a general in the Civil War, is wounded in the Civil War. There are some great love letters between, they're not, they're Victorian, give me a break. They're not, but they're really, really lovely letters, and they are not part of our collection, but one of the direct descendants has loaned them to us, so we get this in there too. So he and his wife Janet and their 3 children live in that house, and we have letters going out. He's the last member of his generation of the family to die, so the natural end to this project is 1920. That's when he's, you know, all the spouses and siblings are deceased by that time. He's the last one to go. Becomes a very successful banker. Is known around town in Auburn as the General. Also has a very, very financially successful career as well. Some really good letters. A lot of problems when he's a kid. See, we know these people from when they're children, you know. A lot of trouble with his eyes. I don't know. I haven't asked anybody to. I need to talk to an optometrist, ophthalmologist, somebody about what he has. But he gets white, crusty. It's a weakness, and it has, you know, he has some stuff that he emits from his eyes. An ongoing problem throughout his childhood that he apparently outgrows. Fanny, the youngest child and the only daughter who survives adulthood, doesn't survive into adulthood by much, does she? This is actually a death painting, Victorian death painting. It's painted after her death. They still got the dress at the museum. The clue here is the one on her left hand. I don't know if you can tell. There's the white glove. That's a sign that she's dead. And the flowers have symbolic significance for death around this. And these are all things that we are learning, but don't know everything about yet. Fanny is, I don't know whether to say she's, some of the students would tell you that she's her father's child. She adores her father. She loves being in Washington, D.C. with him. She loves the social whirl of the diplomatic corps and the parties and the dinners and all of that and the people. She has it in mind from a fairly young age that she does not want to marry. She wants to do something of importance in the world. I think that's the phrase she uses, which she imagines to be writing. She actually has, as a child, she's got a couple short things published in children's magazines. And she keeps diaries, is also a good letter writer. I don't know if you've read any letters written by her. The handwriting is the easiest of any of them. They're like, you know, it's kind of, one of my sisters writes that way, and if she was here, she'd whack me on the side of the head for saying this, but it's kind of childlike even as she gets older, in the sense that the letters are carefully formed, and you know how all of us get sloppier as we get faster. She doesn't, so hers are very easy to read. Henry's are the hardest to read, and by the 1860s, he's just, you know, he'll give you maybe a first letter of the word, and then you just sort of try to figure it out from there. They get really, really hard. And the older that Frances gets, the harder hers are to read, which is not surprising either. But yeah, Fanny dies young. She's a romantic. She likes boys. She just doesn't you know. And this is a typical family portrait in the sense that's, like I said, Gus is off to the side. You know, he's kind of, everything we got about him, he's off to the side. And we think, oh, what happened to poor Gus? We want to give him a hug. We actually used to have where we used to have our lab where we work, we used to have a closet door, and we put a sign on it that said Gus's room, because we just felt like everybody feels for Gus. And I don't know whether he needs it, deserves it, whatever. That's Frances and her three sons, Will being the youngest at that point. Gus is on the right.
Okay.
Yeah. See, again, I mean, you know, he's off to the Gus place. And that's Fanny and her father. There are a couple of really good ones, very tender ones of her and her father. This is fairly late in both of their lives. She dies in 1866. Looks to me like TB. TB and related symptoms. You know, when you die of TB, you don't necessarily die of the TB. It weakens you, and you may die of something else. But yeah, she dies a year after her mother does. And so I gave you a couple of letters just to try to show you the kind of stuff that we're working with. And the range is really extremely wide. And what we did in trying, it has taken us over 6 years to think that we have found all the family letters because, again, they weren't organized in the expectation that anybody would ever be looking for the family letters, anybody who wasn't a family member. And so they were in different places in this huge collection. Some of them were cataloged as part of what's designated general correspondence. Some of them are in a category called miscellaneous. Don't know what that means. Some are in a category called fragments. Fragments is interesting because they aren't fragments. I thought these would be like pieces of things. But there's kind of, again, a miscellaneous hodgepodge of things because there are recipes in there. There are what we would call prescriptions, but they call them recipes. There are also bound volumes, which doesn't tell you what's in it, right? If you say, okay, we've got so many bound volumes. Well, some of them are bound letters. Some of them are household account books, which are, again, utterly fascinating if you're trying to contextualize a family's life and a family's experience. But even in the last 6 months, you've met Lauren, haven't you? Yeah, Lauren Davis has found over 600 family letters in the collection that nobody knew they were there. We think we've now found them all, but we thought we had all found them all before she found 680 or something like that, 600 and something letters. So the complication was partly that the finding aid wasn't made, expecting you to want to find these, but then you also have to use a finding aid and 2 different old-style card catalogs to be sure you've found everything. So I think we found everything now. By having the volunteers work with us, the students were doing about 400 letters a year and then getting them up on the website. That means transcribing them, annotating them. We now have these electronic databases, Ancestry.com, Find a Grave, Political Graveyard if you're looking for dead politicians, that kind of stuff. All of these things, you couldn't do this 10 years ago. You couldn't have found the 18,000 people we have found mentioned in these letters, most of whom, I don't know, most may not be right, but a whole lot of them are women, many of whom changed their names at least once, which makes them harder to find, and they're also not famous. So they don't show up the same way a congressman shows up or a diplomat shows up. But you can now do that with these wonderful, these genealogy databases. They have found, the people working, the volunteers and the students have found 18,000 people. And we're trying to identify all of them at a minimum with their birth date, their death date, and their relationships to any of the other people. You can't do that with everybody. The servants are hard. Fugitive slaves are hard. A lot of people are hard, but if they're finding a very high percentage of these people, which is really pretty cool. And so we were doing about 400 letters a day, and then we started working with volunteers. And now we're doing 600 letters a year, and I just finished writing a grant proposal today that says we can do 800 letters a year, and we can, as long as you all do twice as many letters as you're doing. Okay? Thank you very much. I'd be glad to take any questions you have.
I first would like to make a plug for a membership at the Seward House because you get a lot of information and invited to very lovely events. Also, right now, there's a fashion exhibit going on there with some of the fashions. But my question for you, in going there, the books don't seem to look like they're being preserved in any way that maybe old books would be preserved, and is there a reason for that, or is it money, or?
No, it's a great question. And it's a big problem. In order, early on when I started going there, and the librarians, one of whom is a book preservationist, restorer and preservationist, it's an untenable situation. You need temperature and humidity control, which they don't have. You need, in many cases, you need to clean them page by page, which they have these little tiny vacuum cleaners as sort of a minimal kind of intrusive thing. But what that does is it gets dust and bacteria, paper-eating bacteria off of them. They don't have any of the resources to do that. So I would, personally, and I've got nothing to say about it, I would love to see all the paper out of that house into a controlled environment, because I don't think it's going to be possible to gain control of the environment in a house that's that old. I don't know. I lived in a Victorian house when we lived in New Jersey, and they're wonderful houses, and that house will still be standing long after I'm gone. But temperature and humidity control, I don't think so. So.
Had that issue. Susan B. Anthony House, I'm sure, has that issue, but the Seward House has such a big library of books.
Yeah, yeah, and about 500 of the books are at the University of Rochester, and those are in the rare books collection, so they are okay. And then there's 7,000 books. And one of my favorite things at the Seward House is actually there's behind the glass door is Fanny's library. When she died, her father put all her books together behind a glass door. So there's about 350 books that were Fanny's. And I've gone through all of those to look for the inscriptions and any what do you call it, marginalia that's in them. And most of her books, this is always true for the youngest child anyway, at least this is true in my family, youngest child ends up writing her name in a book that once belonged to her older brother. Yeah, or her mother, or whatever. So a good bit of Fanny's library used to be somebody else's, and then a lot of them are also very literate family. A lot of them were Christmas presents. The sort of relationship between Christmas and gift giving that we have is only just being formed then. Clement Clark Moore's poem, which is quoted in one of the letters that I gave some of you about Christmas, that is creating Christmas for many Americans rather than being an existing pattern. So some of these are New Year's presents, New Year's Day presents, some of them are Christmas presents, a lot of them are given to her as a child, so she grows up to be a very bookish kid too. Anybody else?
All the letters are being archivally preserved, correct?
Yeah, all the letters in 1950 in the will, all the manuscripts were donated to the University of Rochester. There is a problem, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this. But over it's a big house, and there's lots of stuff in this house. Since 1950, they have discovered paper that they didn't know they had there, and I wish they would send that to the University of Rochester Library, not because we need more paper, but because it can be preserved there. And some of the stuff that I worry about the most that's still there that's paper is scrapbooks. Scrapbooks were and are maintained on the cheapest kind of paper. And so these are extremely fragile, and I would love to see them, they have made real progress in getting them into acid-free boxes. But that's we could do better with those. So I would like to see the paper that they have found since 1950 moved out of there. No. What they did at one point. I mean, this is a vast collection of yeah. Are you talking about the ones at the house, or all?
I'm talking the ones at U of R.
No, they were microfilmed in 1970s, but interesting. These are all lessons in the history of technology at different points in time. There were some that were microfilmed twice, some that were missed, and again, the focus was on the public papers rather than the private papers. So what we're doing now is actually preserving them by digitizing the family papers. Yeah. I'm sorry, you were.
Yes, I wanted to know, do you know what the connection was? The family decided to give the papers to the University of Rochester?
Yeah, there was a University of Rochester history professor named Van Dusen who wrote a biography of William Henry Seward, and also a biography of Thurlow Weed, who was Seward's political mentor and the guy who was promoting his career. And he got to be really good friends with William Henry Seward III. And so when he was working on his biography, he was actually doing research there, and then they were bringing some of the papers to the University of Rochester. I mean, this is a public biography, it's a political biography, so they were not working in the papers I'm talking about. And then over the period of the 1940s, Seward was trying to decide where to leave them, and Yale had put in a bid for them, and someplace else, I don't remember where else, but it was the personal connection that got them where they are. Yeah, and then his wife, who survived him, she was his second wife who survived him, she donated. They found more, and she donated more in the 1960s, and also a couple of few objects, material objects also. I would love to see, because I'm not a librarian and these aren't my things. I would love to see all the physical artifacts, and there aren't a lot of them, but all of them, the ones that are at the University of Rochester, go to the museum. There's a really cool snuff box. There's stuff. There's some stuff. I would love to see that all go to the museum, and I'd love to see all the paper come to the University of Rochester, because then those are the places that are best prepared to, not just to take care of them, but also to have people have access to them. When I want that the tea set should be one of the dozens of tea sets they sometimes put out. They don't need another tea set, right? And they don't need another snuff box probably, but it just makes more sense to me. To steward these things and to give people access to them. You can't really go to the museum to do research in the manuscripts. They'll try to make that possible for you, but it's not the ideal situation.
Is there a public viewing of these letters anywhere? I mean, on the internet, is there somewhere you
Yes.
can access them?
I'm sorry. Yes, it's all lowercase. SewardProject.org is the website. It's a public website. So all of the letters that the students have and volunteers have done so far, and all of our guidelines that we follow and that we teach new people who work with us. They're all that, and all these databases of people and books and pets. This was the students. One of the things I love about this project, not being an expert on a lot of it, is that I'm inclined to let the students make a lot of decisions, and they make really good decisions. But one of the decisions that I wouldn't have thought to make is they decided to annotate not just every person mentioned in the letters, but every pet. And they named a lot of animals. Because in a very Victorian way, the squirrels may live outside, but they may be hand-trained to take a nut from you, so the squirrel will get a name, and the goats get a name, and the horses get a name.
Francis writes the word squirrel very squirrely. When I came on that word, I thought, what is squirrel? And then, of course, I learned later that
The kids have taken them as pets.
A pet squirrel.
They're trained in
His
birds
name
and.
was Squirrel.
Oh, that one was named Squirrel. There was one who was named, I'm trying to think of his name. I can't remember his name.
Are you still seeking volunteers? And if you are, briefly, what's their job description?
Well, these three people can tell you as much as I can about what their job is. But what I know is, if you want, I'll take your name and information. Different volunteers do different things. Everybody transcribes. I don't think I have a pen. Okay. Not everybody wants to annotate. Oh, okay. Here. Do you have a pen? Here's one. Thank you. What do you all do?
Transcribe and annotate. Oh, yeah, that's right. We are annotating.
Transcribe.
It's a mercy.
Some people really, for some people, the annotation is their favorite part. I've had a couple of students who I called stalkers. I mean, it's like, sometimes you get into the hunt, and I remember one of them saying, "I couldn't sleep last night until I found whoever it was she was looking for."
Or what that word is.
Yeah.
What is that word?
Yeah.
I actually did a Google search for a word that he was transcribing in order to find the 19th century vocabulary for banking terms, financial terms.
Yeah.
They didn't use the word accrued until almost 1900. And that's what he was trying to describe, but the way
But he didn't have a word for it.
he ended up
That's
using
pretty
the
cool.
word mortgage. And what we thought was the capital letter of the word. It dawned on me.
This-
And how
this-
I discovered that was bringing up the Spencerian script.
Yeah.
And looking what.
I worked on that one too.
Yeah.
But that was crazy, but it's fun to do that.
And there's no science to the annotation either. I like to when I've taught them, once in a while they'll come up with this idea. Well, first you do this. First you check Ancestry.com, or first you say, well, no, there's no science to it. Sometimes I find something that nobody else, because I get the letters last. Sometimes I find something that I know somebody has spent hours or days looking for, and I find it like that. But it's just a different pair of eyes looking at it from a different angle. And it's just as important. I tell this all the time. It's not important to sit there until you're frustrated and not having fun. It's important to go away from it and then come back.
But see, that's the difference, okay? You said about the male and the female way of doing it. She said, turn it in and let them figure it out.
You're not going to do that.
I can't do that.
Thank you. I got plenty to do. Yeah.
Letters that were written to Seward over the course of his career.
They're all here too. They're all here.
They're in this collection?
Yeah. We've got to and from. So we started this. I guess what do I say? We started this project over several times because we were saying, okay, so we're going to do the Seward family papers. What's the family? And at first I said, okay, well, why don't we just use that, that silhouette I showed you? Why don't we just say that's the family? Those are the people who lived in the house all together in the 1830s and 1840s, and then things started to change. So we started off that way. And then we realized, well, Henry's from Florida, Orange County, New York, near Goshen. And gosh, how are you going to do the Seward family without doing his father, who's a real patriarchal character, very interesting man, and very, very difficult to all his children. And mother, who they would describe as saintly. How are you going to do it without Henry's parents? And we've got her parent, her surviving parent. That would be, so we got to do all the, and there's a lot of correspondence there. And then I started thinking, well, what about Henry's brothers and sister? Because these are all, right, these are family networks and identities of siblings are very much, we know that, right? Formed in relationship to each other. How are we going to know Henry if we don't know his, and then that brings in the spouses and the children of these letters. And then, I said to the students, I've been looking off into some of Francis's correspondence with other women. I'd make these plunges once in a while. Because yes, we've got incoming letters. We also have a lot of outgoing letters, which you often don't have in collections like this. You have them for a couple of reasons, but they made their way back to this collection in one way or another. I said, how are you going to know all these stories, right? So these stories come up, and the death of the baby in 1837. They had this perfectly healthy baby. Doctor comes to their house for what we would call a well baby visit. Comes directly to their house from a house where there's smallpox. The doctor, when Frances figures this out, she's ready to kill the doctor, kill herself. It's infuriating. The baby dies early 1837. Some of you have that letter from little Gus, who's writing to his aunt about his sister Neely, who has died, and his mother didn't want him to see her when she was so sick because he wanted her to remember her, and she was too good for the world. He's mouthing his mother's instructions, but we'll all get to, if we're good, we'll all get to see her someday. All that kind of stuff. And then I started seeing some of these letters that were coming to her from other women who were sympathizing with her loss and her frustration and her anger and her guilt and her sadness and everything. And what they're including in their letters is their own stories. A lot of them have lost a child. So I said, how are we going to know where these stories go if we're not doing their friends as well? So we're doing family extended, we're doing friends, and the friends, the other women who are almost all of whom live somewhere in upstate in western New York. And it's, to be sure, it's defined by class. These are women of the same circumstances, by and large. But we do have letters from the servants. Got to include the servants as family, because it's so difficult to reach down below the upper middle class for history. They go on a family trip in 1835, leave one of the kids behind at the house in the care of one of the servants, and she's writing under instructions on a regular basis to say how the little boy is doing, and these are just priceless things. So our family has changed. It's stable now. It's not going to change again, but it's hard. And the one thing, unless you all do a whole lot more letters, the one thing that I can't figure out how to do because of resources is Henry's correspondence with Thurlow Weed, who's the newspaper editor and political behind-the-scenes guy. I found some really interesting family stories embedded in the letters that were mostly about politics. And that's often the case, because these are guys. They're writing, 75% of the letters is about politics. And then there's these 2 paragraphs about what is wrong with Frances that you can't, in 1835, that you can't find in her correspondence, in her sisters, and her friends' correspondence. He's talking to Weed about it in this letter that's 75% about Whig politics. So I'd say that's one of the things that I didn't know so clearly when we started that I now think now this separation between public life and private life. I mean, you think about it for 10 minutes, you realize that it's not. It's all connected. And she has strong views about politics, and he's not home for Christmas. I gave some of you a letter in which he's not home for Christmas. He is, somebody tracked this. 80% of the Christmases he misses when the kids are little, and this hurts her feelings.
You could explain Gus.
There's a lot of things that, yeah. Anybody else? We did? Yeah.
Wasn't there a place on the Underground Railroad?
They did. They did have people, fugitives come through their house.
Was any mention made after the Civil War in their letters at all about that?
Yeah, but not, almost, but not quite. Her sister, Frances' sister Lizette, her older sister Lizette, is absolutely the best letter writer of any of them, all right? She has a great sense of humor. Once in a while, she writes a letter in the voice of the dog. The dog will write a letter to Fanny when Fanny's little, and there'll be a little paw print. They're just she's got a great sense of humor. She's also very interesting for a lot of other reasons. She is more. Frances is very public-minded, but she doesn't believe women should vote, and she doesn't, so she's not at the cutting edge of that. Even though Elizabeth Cady Stanton's a friend of the family, but she doesn't believe that. Lizette does believe in all of that, and Lizette is more involved than Frances is. And I once read in one of these books that's about Henry that he knew Harriet Tubman. Well, he met Harriet Tubman because Lizette, who was involved in the Underground Railroad, introduced Frances to Harriet Tubman, who then introduced Harriet Tubman to Henry. So it's only from the women that he knows her, and they hold the mortgage on Harriet Tubman's house. She buys her house from them, and we have the records of all of that too. But I am answering your question because after the Civil War, Lizette's daughter, who's also named Frances, writes a memory. It's not a full-blown memoir, but it's 25 to 30 pages long, and it's about her involvement in the Underground Railroad. And so that's is the best source we have. And then once in a while, there are a couple of stories in which they're trying to get Henry when he's in Washington to get the children of a woman who's escaped slave, who's staying with them, from Maryland to New York. And bribes are going to be involved, and it's pretty complicated. So once in a while you get a story like that.
What was their religious life?
She attended the Episcopal Church. He wasn't terribly religious. I think maybe originally Presbyterian. But I would say, you know, kind of liberal and didn't go to church if it was raining. She was very spiritual, but, you know, not absolutely. And she really thought Finney and the other evangelical preachers were not her style. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed talking to you.